So here we go. So basically, we're exempt from obtaining a research authorization because we have this policy that's been approved by DPR. And as long as we follow all policy instructions and all of the laws and regulations that fall outside of this policy, as long as we're in compliance, then we don't need a research authorization. There are just like a couple of exceptions to that. And one is if you, and I don't think the exceptions apply to most people. One is if you're using genetically modified microbes as part of your pesticide trials, you have to get a research authorization. And if in some uses of groundwater chemicals, but we'll actually talk about that in more detail. So those are the two areas where you would have to get a research authorization, and you wouldn't be exempted from that. But otherwise, you don't have to go through the DPR process. We have our own process. I don't approve things. You know, the research authorization is requesting approval by DPR to do this research. And I don't like approve or deny. I just consult and I help you comply and do the right thing. So if we're a UC employee, for example, a lot of times at the Recs, we're doing research applications, but we're also doing basic maintenance applications. So if you're a UC employee and you're making applications for pest control purposes, so you're controlling your weeds on the right of way or along the irrigation ditch, or you're managing some pest in the ornamental plantings that are just for decoration, aesthetics, that is pesticides for pest control purposes. So if you're using a restricted material and those applications, then you do actually have to get a restricted materials permit. However, if you are conducting a research trial and you happen to be including restricted materials in those research trials, then you're not required to get a restricted materials permit for those purposes. So a reminder that experimental pesticide use can take many forms. So, but the intent is that the application is made for research purposes only. No commercial pest control benefit is intended or expected. So we might be working with a cooperator, and if they get some economic, benefit from doing this trial from us, if it's incidental to the research, that's fine, but it isn't the reason for the research, right? And then applications must conform to state and federal guidelines, except when we're exempted from them under this policy. So research using pest control chemicals, let's call them pesticides because that's what they are, can consist of either experimental pesticide application, so number of compounds, or applications made strictly in accordance with California labels, or both. Anything experimental has to conform with this policy. So this is just a recognition that sometimes you're following all label instructions and you're just comparing efficacy of an available product with something new that you're doing research on. So it's totally fine to mix and match, but it's those experimental applications that sometimes you have additional notification and reporting requirements on. And I'll get to those. Okay. So university property, this is a definition in the policy. It means land owned or controlled by the UC and includes only property over which the UC maintains day-to-day control. Usually it's, a research and extension center, or it's a campus field station. There is a USDA field station that we have, like one of our campuses has a memorandum of agreement under, and so runs anybody doing research out there they're in complete control of their research plots as if they were on campus, and so it's the same. So non-UC property just means you're working with a cooperator. So it's just UC property and non-UC property. It's important to know the distinction because some of our procedures are different. So property that's not UC property is under the day-to-day control of somebody else. Like you could show up at the field and people are walking through your research plots. I mean, I know that doesn't happen that often, but it's more possible than on UC property. Okay. So if you're working with parks, then the park is non-UC property, obviously, like a local county, state park. Or if you're working with a private landowner, putting out some walnut trials. So that's a cooperator, that's non-UC property. So we've got another poll for you about UC property.
Okay, so this poll is asking, is there anything you have to do differently when you are making experimental pesticide applications off of university property? So your responses are, you can choose one of these. So no, your procedure will stay the same whether you're on or off university property. Yes, you have to file an Appendix 1 when you are off university property. Or yes, you have to post warning signs when you are off university property. So which one of those do you think is the correct answer to the question? Is there anything you have to do differently when making experimental pesticide applications off of university property? We'll give everyone a few more seconds. You guys are speedy. Your polling hands are warmed up. Okay, wow. Everyone responded. Great, that's awesome. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to share the results. All right.
Okay, thank you. So the first question, I'm sorry. The first answer is no, my procedure is the same whether I'm on or off. That is not like 100% true. If you responded yes, so 49% of you responded yes, I have to file an Appendix 1 when I'm off university property, and that's the difference. And that's true. This is the correct answer, the second one. And then the third one, I have to post warning signs when I'm off university property. Here's the thing. When you're on university property, oftentimes you do have to post warning signs as well. So everything is the same except the Appendix 1. Okay, so the Appendix 1 is the first page in your handout. I'm going to go ahead and switch to my handouts just to show you what I'm talking about. And Sarah put a link in the chat up above to the policy and procedure manual, and that you can find the Appendix 1 there as well. But let me just go ahead and share my handouts really fast.
I also just posted a link to the Appendix 1 in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Because yes, now like the online version is a fillable form.
Mm-hmm.
So here, let's go over the Appendix 1. So Appendix 1 is required for experimental pesticide applications that are conducted off university property. Okay, so this is the primary difference. All the other procedures should be essentially the same. And so this is specifically for experimental. So something that's you don't have a label for, or you're using it in conflict with the label. Okay, and this has to be off university property. Okay, so here is a key statement. At least 24 hours before your first experimental application is conducted, the first drop, 24 hours before the first drop of pesticide that you don't have a label to support your use, you have to submit this form. You have to file this form. So tell me, who are you giving this form to? I tell you to file the form. That means give it to somebody, right? There are 3 people who get a copy of this filled out form. Tell me who they are. You can tell me in the chat because I know you can't actually unmute. Who are you giving a copy of this form to? The grower, that's what George says. That's 1, that's correct. Ag commissioner, that's 2, that's correct. Okay. And then Stephanie says, keep one for yourself. So there's 3 copies. Okay. If the printer in your office works, then awesome. But if you're like me, I don't know, my printer doesn't work here. I don't know what to do, but I'm going to get over it. So, okay, you need 3 forms. And so really the person who needs it that 24 hours before the first drop of experimental pesticide is your ag commissioner. And obviously you're just going to keep a copy for yourself, but you need to also give a copy to the cooperator, because whoever it is you're working with, because They just might need this if they're inspected. They need to have this form. And so if they keep their records electronically, then it's okay to send them this record electronically. That's fine. And if your ag commissioner accepts them electronically, I don't know if they do. I think the answer depends. Is you ask all 58 counties, you're going to get 58 different answers. So, follow their instructions, how they want to receive this. So this serves as our notice of intent. So usually if somebody gets a regular person, not us, not UC people, just a regular pesticide applicator in the state of California has to get a restricted materials permit. And then, 24 hours ahead of their restricted materials application, or maybe it's 48, I don't know, we have to notify the ag commissioner. This is our notice of intent, whether it's restricted materials or not. They just want to know that they just want to be prepared that we're doing this stuff. So 24 hours is the minimum, but let me just encourage you that if you have more time, if you can notify them with more advance notice, please do that. Okay. Because they like to know what's going on, not just so they can come out and inspect you, but just because they get questions from people and they need to know what's going on so that they can answer the questions. Okay. So it's the same form for every county. It's a university form. Okay. So here we're going to put the county, county of the application. Sometimes you guys are working in multiple counties, and that's totally cool. So then you're going to put the name, address, phone number of the research supervisor. That's somebody at the UC. Sometimes it's the PI. Sometimes it's, the SRA that's really responsible for carrying out all the operations. Whoever puts their name here, whatever name goes here, that's the person that's responsible. That's the person that's going to get called if something bad happens. So, you might want to have some discussions with your staff or your supervisor to discuss, like whose name goes there. And then the grower's name. This says grower, but it really should say cooperator. And in fact, I'm going to see if I can change that on the form. I'm going to make a note. I don't know why I just thought of that. Okay, thank you. And so their contact information. So whoever puts their name here has to have a QAL or a QAC, and then you have to put that number here. Okay. And let me just be clear, when we're making pesticide applications that you see, like experimental applications, we have to have a QAC or a QAL. You can't do experimental pesticide applications without a license or certificate. Let me just be clear. So somebody has to have that qualification, and then not everybody on staff who's involved in the application has to have this, but somebody does, and that person is responsible. Okay. And then, so here it says you need to tell them the pesticides that are going to be applied, including product name, experimental number, or whatever information you have. And you can just attach that, like your trial list or something like that. Location of the trial and site ID number. So you're working with a cooperator. They should have a site ID number with the county. And so put that down there so that the ag commissioner can connect it with the piece of land where you're making that pesticide application. Size of the trial, commodity to be treated. So if you're not treating a commodity, then just put whatever you're treating. It's really the site to be treated. So if that happens to be a walnut orchard, say that. If it's a rice field, say that. Or if it's ornamental plantings, say that. Okay. So your anticipated dates of first and last applications. And then here, this is what's really important. You need to tell the ag commissioner, like, I'm doing an experimental pesticide application. Sometimes that means we have to do crop destruct, and we're going to talk about those rules in more detail, but sometimes we have to do crop destruct and sometimes we don't. Okay. So you need to tell them what your intent is. Like, I've determined the crop can enter the channels of trade. I'm not crop destructing. I'm going to destroy the crop because, I put out pesticides that aren't registered. Or if you have like a non-crop or a non-bearing crop, like a first-year vineyard, a first-year orchard, that it's just not bearing, there's no crop destruct to do, right? Okay. So you just got to tell them what's going on with the harvest situation. And then tell them the anticipated date of the harvest or the destruction, and then signature, and then some phone number. Okay, so any questions on this Appendix 1?
Yeah, Lisa, we have a few questions in the Q&A, so I'll just go down the list. So the first question's from John, and they're asking, in urban locations such as a residential property, what is the site identification number?
You would have to ask your cooperator. So they, like if they report pesticide use regularly, then they would have a site ID number, because it's connected. I mean, I can double check that. Maybe Sarah knows. She's helped me do some research into pesticide use reports, but I believe it's not just the ag applications that have a site ID, but it might also be like the landscape applications. But either Sarah or I will check on that. I do believe that they would have a site ID. And if they don't, it's whatever they use to report their regular pesticide use, because they're still reporting pesticide use. So like if you put out a trial on cooperator's property, they have to report that pesticide use, or you tell them what you applied and then they've put it in their report. So the ag commissioner is just trying to connect your Appendix 1 to their pesticide use report. Okay, so whatever it is that they use to identify, it could be a site ID, it could be something else, but we'll dig that up for you.
Okay. So the next question is, do we need an Appendix 1 if we're doing a collaborative experimental pesticide trial that is sprayed by the grower?
Yes, that's a good question. That's a good nuance. So if it's experimental and that grower is not applying for a research authorization, then that means you have to file this form. Okay, so if we're working under our policy instead of the research authorization process, then yes, we have to fill out this form. So you're responsible in some way, and hopefully the grower also has their QAL or QAC. That's my assumption. Okay, but yeah, that's a great question.
Okay. And then we have a question about organic pesticides. So is DPR or CCOF, I don't know what that stands for, but is DPR or CCOF the agent to approve the registration for organic?
It's always EPA and then DPR, EPA first and then DPR. So CCOF is the California Certified Organic Farms, right? And so that's a third-party organic certification body. They do not approve, they may approve or disapprove of pesticides for organic use, but they don't approve or disapprove of the registration. So many organic pesticides are registered either by EPA or by EPA and DPR. So if you have, if you are applying a pesticide that has an EPA registration number, then you do have to fill out this form. You have to, and you're using it in an experimental way. You would have to, fill out this form. You'd have to report the pesticide use. It's a pesticide. If it's organic or not, it's still a pesticide if you're trying to kill a pest. So it is, there's a slide in this deck. It might be one of the optional slides. I can't remember at the moment, but I talk about a little bit about organic research trials. And so maybe can we hold that to the end, and I'll just make sure I talk about it.
Okay.
Or, I mean, if you want to make sure that I address your questions, then you can just give me more questions, even though I'm just going to answer them later. That would be great.
Okay, so, we have, okay, there's a few that popped in. I'm trying to see if they are relevant. Yeah, so if we are doing a pesticide trial with products that are not experimental and following the label, we do not need to file an Appendix A. I'm assuming they mean Appendix 1. They just need to have the cooperator report use. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you're doing research, but you've got a label to support your use, you're following the label instructions, and you're doing that on cooperator's property, it's not in an experimental application. It's research, but it's not an experimental application. So you would not need to fill out the Appendix 1. But yes, your cooperator would need to report the pesticide use.
Okay. And then for filling out the Appendix 1, someone had a question about, so if they're specifically using a pre-emergent pesticide, the commodity to be treated, would they say it's soil? Or what would they consider the commodity in that situation?
So the question about commodity, like on this form, is totally related to whether or not it's connected to the concept of whether or not you have to do crop destruct. So I would put the actual commodity, but I would specify, pre-emergent on strawberry. So if you're doing a soil fumigant application, for example, or maybe you're doing a pre-emergent herbicide application and nothing's been planted yet, but something will be planted. Because the idea is that, there will still be likely will still be residues in the soil when you do go in and plant. So yeah, whatever that commodity is going to be growing there after your pre-emergent application. But you can specify pre-emergent to strawberries or whatever it is.
Okay, so then a quick follow-up question regarding that site identification number, and maybe we'll just address this later, but they're asking if the homeowner would know the site ID number if they're not applying the pesticides.
So a homeowner would not have a site ID if you're talking truly about like at somebody's home. There wouldn't be I know for sure there wouldn't be a site ID. So I don't know if you're talking about, just like landscape applications in somebody's home garden or whatever, yard, or if you're talking about structural applications. So there would not be a site ID number. So again, it's like whatever a profession, for example, if you're talking about structural applications, I can't see who asked the question, so I don't know. But if you're like whatever, like if a professional structural pest control board certified applicator were making that same application, how would they identify the property? It wouldn't be through a site ID. So you would just use whatever identifying information that a professional would have to use in their pesticide use report.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think we're done with questions, so
okay.
Continue on.
All right, so let me go back to my PowerPoint. Okay, yeah, we talked about all that. So if we don't comply with this policy, we'll lose our policy and then we'll have to get research authorizations, which means every time you want to put out an experimental trial, you have to ask permission from the Department of Pesticide Regulation. So how about let's not do that? I don't think that would be good for business. I don't think that would be good for your research programs. And so that's why compliance is really important. So just, this is just a note and I don't want to belabor it, but DPR changed the research authorization process. And so how I just said that the Appendix 1 has to be filed at least 24 hours ahead of the application. Outside people, those without a policy that are getting research authorizations, they have to give 72 hours notice to their ag commissioner, do their notice of intent or whatever. So DPR is asking for you to give ag commissioners more time, but it's not required for us. Okay. But if you're able to give them more notice, then please do that.